Thank you so much, Bo, for a wonderful introduction. And a very warm welcome to all of you who have joined us today for this lecture. I would also like to thank Professor Huskin and Professor Sachs again for coming up with this idea of organizing a lecture series on Hindu-Muslim relations. And I must say it's a very timely intervention given the kind of communal incidents and hate politics that has actually taken place in recent years. And we all actually know about it, what is happening in India and right now and previously in the last 30 years. This talk is this talk is also very timely because yesterday was the anniversary of Babri Mosque demolition. And in this presentation, I will refer to the issue of disputes at sacred sites. Although it is of a different nature in different social setting, but still I think, we will be able to actually make some connections. Let me share my PowerPoint before I say more. Okay. Can you see it?
Yep.
Okay. 1 second. So as you can see on the screen of your computers, the talk is titled as Neighbors Without Borders, the integrated shrine of Islamic and Hindu religious figures. So clearly I'm going to focus on a unique shrine which has thrived and become a center of popular devotion only in the last 30 to 35 years. But before I do so, I would also like you to know about the current state of this project. The research for this project is actually still in its beginning phase. And believe me, it's not a sign of a boring talk. The project actually wasn't part of my doctoral dissertation, nor does it relate to my current postdoctoral project, as Bo said, which is supported by the Alexander von Humboldt Foundation and focuses on the issue of religious conversion of Muslim Naths or Yogis in the same field area where I have previously done my field work. So research for this talk is in a way more of a side work that I did during the field work related to the Humboldt project. Following a research party, it's a very interesting story actually. Following a research participant, I serendipitously came across the shrine, which is the field site of this discussion. And since then, I got very interested in it and I started collecting data. I'm thinking of doing more work on this research once the Humboldt project is over. And if you are listening carefully, then please hire me after 1 year on this project. A bit of self-marketing. Anyway, the talk has 4 parts. In the beginning, I'll give you a brief background information of the area and the field site, followed by the stories of establishment of the shrine in the second part. In the third section, I will talk about recent intra-religious disputes at the shrine. And in the fourth and the final part, I'll briefly discuss about social construction and production of a religious space, which has fast transformed by the power, money, and wealth of urban devotees. On the basis of my material, I'm making 3 tentative claims. I'm not calling them, they're arguments, but they're tentative arguments. First, borrowing largely from some recent writings of American scholars, such as Joyce Flukiger, Peter Goschak, and Anna Bigelow, among others, I make the first claim that communal or religious divisions between Hindus and Muslims do not exist for all South Asians at all times and at all levels of social and religious domains. Fairly simple argument. In the claim number 2, I'm trying to come up with a new concept called cooperative segregation to actually better understand the complex nature of religious interaction at these shared sacred shrines. Unlike some essential claims made by scholars such as Robert Hayden, and Robert Hayden has actually written a very wonderful article. But the reason actually I choose Haydn's piece, to emphasize here, there are a couple of reasons. First of all, I mean, it is cited more than 500 times and is one of the most famous articles written in the last 20 years on the topic. But in his thesis, what Haydn does, I mean, I believe, he makes some essentialist, universal and essentialist claims. For example, Haydn says in the very opening pages of, and this will also give you a summary of his ideas. And I quote here, this paper develops the concept of competitive sharing to explain how sacred sites that have long been shared by members of different religious communities and may even exhibit syncretic mixtures of the practices of both may come to be seized or destroyed by members of one of them in order to manifest dominance over the other. This competitive sharing is compatible with the passive meaning of tolerance as non-interference, but incompatible with the active meaning of tolerance as embrace of the other. So clearly you can see Haydn actually makes a couple of universal and essential claims. And some of his essential notions may work in the context of interreligious disputes, but the thesis completely fails when it comes to the disputes of intra-religious nature. Basically, those disputes that are confined to one religious group. I counter Haydn's thesis of competitive sharing, although I really like the article, as I already said. And countering him, I claim the process of sharing a sacred shrine is not always antagonistic to the symbols of religious others. Claim number 1. In the claim number B, I say competition may result in sustaining, opposite to Haydn, sustaining the symbols of religious others, thereby furthering a culture of religious coexistence. And in the third, and furthermore, these two things that I just pointed out do not happen for manifesting dominance or controlling resources as Haydn would have it, but can also happen purely for the reasons of faith. And that's my argument. That's my main argument opposite to Haydn's claim. In the third and the final claim, I argue urban religious spaces formed by religious beliefs become elements of urban life or may change the spatial topography of a space by flows of material resources and wealth. Before we move on, some contextual details are required. The research work was carried out in Alwar. You can see a map of Rajasthan on the left side of your screen, in which Alwar is located in the easternmost part of Rajasthan, right here. Here is Alwar, on the border of Haryana. In the second map on the right side, you can also see Alwar is very close to New Delhi, India's capital city. The present day Alwar district of Rajasthan was formerly a princely state and ruled by kings, and but indirectly governed by the British by a political resident until 1947, when India and Pakistan actually got their respective independence, which was accompanied with a violent process of partition. We all know about it. And I wouldn't go into details here, but also I want to actually tell you a bit more about Alwar. Alwar had it still continues to have a sizable number of the Muslim population, reaching up to the mark of almost 50% in North Alwar. And it was a sufficient reason behind violence during partition in which so many people lost their lives. Some scholars like Selma Aram and Ian Copeland in their writings actually note horrific cases of killings, mainly of Muslims. And particularly Ian Copeland terms the killings of Muslims in Alwar as an instance of ethnic cleansing, which was executed with the state support. So Alwar has a history of horrific communal violence. I would not go into more details here because I mean, it will take our time. So now moving to the next slide. In the next slide, this is the shrine that I was talking about a few minutes ago. As you can clearly see, there are two gates that grant access to the entire inner shrine. A visitor can actually enter from either gates and still visit the whole inner premises. The in the left the board above the left side gate in green letters reads Sayyid Darbar, meaning the court of Sayyids. And this gate on the left gives a direct access to the two Islamic saints, while on the other side, the place is actually identified as a temple of Sankat Mochan Bir Hanuman. And written on the top part of the gate in white letters. The temple is dedicated to the Hindu monkey god Hanuman with special powers of Sankat Mochan. The epithet Sankat Mochan means the one who eradicates pain and suffering. And just behind the shrine, if you look closely, you can see the downtown Alwar. And beyond that, the city is bounded by the hills of the Arauli Mountains on its western side. Here is another image and a better view of the city and the hills. Inside the shrine, if you enter from the left gate, there are two identical graves, namely of Sayyid Ali Rahman Badshah on the left and of Pathan Jume Khan Baba on the right. Sayyid Ali Rahman Badshah is the main saint here. He's the patron god here and the oldest resident of the shrine. But his origins are actually unknown. Nobody knows where, who he was and where did he actually come from. And but the grave of Pathan Jume Khan Baba on the right was relocated here from somewhere else, and much later after the already existing grave of Ali Rahman Badshah. The relocation story actually happened, and it's a very interesting story and narrative. The relocation story happened by the order of none other than the Hindu god Shiva. And I will come to this relocation story of the grave of Jume Khan in a while, that highlights an intricate or complex nature of religious interaction in South Asia, where not only human beings, but sometimes gods and saints of different religious backgrounds also cooperate and collaborate. And I'll come to this story in a while. Moving on, here in the first image from the left, adjacent to the grave of Pathan Jume Khan Baba is the temple of Hanuman, located directly opposite to the entry point for his place. Entry point for his place. On the in the middle picture, on the right side wall of the Hanuman temple, there is an image of Shiva. In the you can see in the middle picture, he's sitting in a meditative position like a yogi. So next to him, there's also, if you look carefully, there's next to just the picture of Shiva. Here is a campfire dhuni of Guru Gorakhnath, which symbolizes the presence of Nath tradition and Guru Gorakhnath here. This is in the middle picture. This is a dhuni in the left image. Here is the dhuni is located. There's also a lingam, a phallic representation of Shiva in this shrine, just next to, behind the dhuni. And near the entrance gate, on the right side of the shrine, there is a small cabinet that houses Bhairav, a tantric deity and another incarnation of Shiva, worshipped by mostly by Hindus. In some cases, actually, in Tibetan Buddhism, Bhairav is also worshipped, but here, I mean, it is mostly worshipped by Hindus. Most importantly, there also lives a well-fed cow, dear to Nath yogis and other Saivites. In this image, actually, you can see all these worship spaces are organized in a seamless, a wall-less spatial manner with from the two graves, and which allows free movement of devotees from one worship place to the other. And there's no barrier at all. People come here and they actually worship to all the gods. Sometimes they either go to the temple of Hanuman first, and then actually they move to the grave of two saints. I'm actually going to show you a small video clip now, this one, which will give you an idea of what happens during prayer times and how visitors frequently switch sides and participate in prayers at various worship spaces. So in this video, I mean, you can see people are actually praying to all the saints at the same time. And when Aarti actually happens uh, at the Hanuman temple, which starts around 7 o'clock every day in the evening, many devotees of the saints quickly come and join the prayer. And in this video, I mean, you can see people whose heads are covered. They were actually praying to the saints before, and they actually later on join the prayers in front of the Hanuman temple. Also, sometimes devotees who circumambulate the graves, they too start chanting the Aarti prayers without joining the others in the front of the temple. So, I mean, we see a lot of sort of shifting in movie, and there's people visiting sort of both Hindu figures as well as Islamic saints. What happens every Thursday, in this picture you can see, Qawwali, or a musical performance for the saints, is also organized. And in the image on the left, you can see that there are, the Qawwali is basically sung by mostly Muslim singers who also sing bhajan for Hanuman. So in this picture, there are sort of yogi bards and mirasis who normally every Thursday, they are hired by sort of managers of the science, and they perform Qawwali as well as bhajans to Hanuman. Outside at the same time, in another image, a ritual feast of Bhandara goes on, financed by either a devotee. I mean, it happens at the same time. So, and the Bhandara is either is financed by either a devotee whose wishes are fulfilled, or in some cases, the managers of the shrine can also arrange the distribution of such.
Okay, could you speak a bit louder, please?
Okay. Should I use my microphone?
Just leaning up, that was better. You lean forward, that's fine.
Okay. Let me use my microphone. Loud. I don't have microphone, but I'll use this. Is it better?
Yes.
Yeah, much better.
Okay. I should have actually used it earlier. So every Thursday, I was telling you what happens. Qawwali, a musical performance for the saints, is also organized, which is sung by mostly Muslim singers who also sing bhajans for Hanuman. Outside, at the same time, a ritual feast of Bhandara goes on, financed by either a devotee whose wishes are fulfilled by the boon of saints or Hanuman, or in some cases, the managers of the shrine can also arrange the distribution of ritual offerings. And in most cases, it is usually kheer, rice pudding. And if only if a devotee is not available to finance a ritual feast. So the first part is actually over here. And hopefully, I mean, I'm able to actually give you some brief background information. Now I'm actually moving into the second part of the presentation, into the details about the previous situation of the site where the shrine is actually located now, and the story of its successful establishment by the order and blessings of Shiva. So before the establishment of the shrine here, there was this fort. you can see it on your screen. This palace, which is located at the center of the flat hilltop of a hillock. And here is another picture, and in here is another picture, and in this picture, you can clearly see the palace is actually located on a large isolated mound of rocks, and it had 4 levels with more than actually more than 100 rooms and an area size of around 46,000 square feet. The palace was actually built in 1882 by the then Maharaja of Alwar, Mangal Singh, and was known by 2 names, Lansdowne Palace and Moti Dungri Palace. Lord Lansdowne was the Viceroy of India and had visited the palace in 1888. And the second name, Moti Dungri, which means in Hindi, Pearl Fort. Moti means pearl, and Dungri in Rajasthani is its fort, is more popular nowadays because of a pearl-like design of the fort area, entire fort area. The palace remained the main residence of successive kings of the Alwar princely estate until its demolition in 1928. And demolition, you can see in this picture, there's no palace. So this demolition actually happened by the order of the then king Jai Singh, who ruled Alwar from 1892 to I think 1937. And Jai Singh was famous for his eccentric behavior. And by his order, the palace was actually dismantled with an idea of building a new palace at the same site. But the new project actually never pulled off, and the palace remained in ruins since then. There was no construction. And you clearly see a bird eye view of the area surrounding the fort, the entire area, the entire design attached to is pearl-like shape. And for almost, and in this picture, you can also see on the 3rd level, this is ground level, the road that connects to the, that goes all the way to the top. This is 2nd level where there is a park located. On the 3rd level, there is a shrine, and the palace was actually located here on the 4th level. So for almost 60 years, the abandoned fort was free of human activities until the development of the integrated religious shrine in the 1980s. The present priest of the Hanuman temple, who is actually sitting by the Dhuni campfire, and the main custodian of this shrine, Namalnath, he first came to this palace in the 1980s after he received an order, as he told me in an interview. Sorry, directly from Shiva. And before that, he was not a priest. He had a pan shop. Those who are from South Asia, they will understand the concept of pan shop, a shop for selling tobacco, betel leaves, and cigarette at the center of one of the Alwar's main markets, that is known as Tripolia Bazaar. This market, which is known as Tripolia Bazaar, or the market of 3 pillars. The bazaar received its name from a massive 3-pillared gate that is part of the Alwar city fort. The gate actually commands access to passages at a crossroads. And sorry, in this picture, actually, the gate is not, the gate is barely visible. But if you look at clearly, it's located right at the end. This is the gate. The photo was actually taken from a distance, and sorry for it. But moving on, I mean, in one corner of this tomb-like gate, a temple of the god Shiva called Tripolia Mahadev, or the Shiva of the 3-pillared gate, is situated on a high platform. You can see the platform here where people actually standing in front of it, almost actually touching the dome or the roof of the gate. Underneath the platform There is also a grave of the saint Pathan Jume Khan Baba, same saint, and which is actually relocated now at the top of the Moti Dungri hill and is a part of the integrated shrine. So the relocation story, I'm coming to the relocation story of Jume Khan here, reveals a highly complex nature of Indic sacred life in which religious boundaries have a tenuous wall. According to popular belief, the Islamic saint requested the Hindu god Shiva that he felt claustrophobic lying in this dark cabinet and pleaded to get him out in an open area. And to his request, Shiva promised Pathan Jume Khan Baba, since he was obediently lying in the god's feet, um, nobody knows for how long. And so he said that he will send him to one of the highest places in Alwar and get a place for him, which was going to be in the integrated shrine yet to be made for him and others. Navalnath, Navalnath, Navalnath was a devout follower of Shiva and regularly attended the temple prayers at Tripolia Bazaar, spending a lot of time singing bhajans, religious songs. One day when he was riding his scooter with a friend sitting on the back seat, the scooter actually stopped in front of the Shiva temple and he heard a message. And the message said, 11 रुपए का प्रसाद ले और सीधा ऊपर चला जा, which means take ritual offerings worth 11 rupees and directly go to the top. In this sonic message, he was given a vague command to follow a route directly to the top. The order actually required a little deciphering on the part of Navalnath, and he thought Alwar is actually bounded by the Aravalli hills, but my scooter is not positioned in that direction. And he further thought the hills are very far, at least 7-8 kilometers or 10 kilometers, and are all located on western side of the city, not in the direction of my scooter. And as he stood there dumbfounded, deciphering the meaning in the command, he heard another voice. And the another voice said, Moti Dungri ke upar ja, which means, and asking and pressing him to go to the top of the Moti Dungri hillock, the current palace, which actually I showed you the picture a while ago, where the shrine is located. Navalnath bought offerings along with his friend, followed the message and reached at the bottom of the Moti Dungri hillock with no clue about how to reach to the top. He kept taking rounds on his scooter around the bottom of the hillock in attempts to find a way to the top. Unfortunately, there was no direct passage to the top at that time. Remember, this was the 1980s. So one had to pick his way through a thick forest of thorny acacia trees, as well as stone rubbles left behind after the palace was abandoned in 1928. So what Navalnath did, he actually parked his scooter in one corner, and he and his friend clambered all the way to the top. And upon reaching there, surprised as they were, because there was nothing except debris, just stone rubbles and debris, nothing else. So as they were roaming around, suddenly Navalnath's eyes caught a sight of a dilapidated grave of the saint. This one, of Sayyid Ali Rahman Badshah. Obviously, it was not in the same situation back then, because this picture was taken in 2019. And on some distance from the grave, there was also a damaged idol, which in Hindi, damaged idol means Khandit Murti, of the Hindu monkey god Hanuman. So Navalnath offered the ritual materials to Hanuman and to the grave. And as soon as he closed his eyes afterwards to pray to them, a voice gave him another command saying, "Is jagah ko tujhe hari karni hai," which means you have to turn this place green, alive. So Navalnath actually has finally reached to a place where he could actually carry on with his sadhana or meditation in, in peace. In order to fulfill Shiva's command, another grave symbolizing the presence of Pathan Jume Kha Baba, this one, was then constructed. And it was constructed in, I think, 1890s, somewhere around the 1890s. So a brick was actually taken from the previous grave site of the saint and was used to build a new place for him next to the already existing grave of Ali Rahman Badshah. How I have already told you how and why the grave of the saint Sayyid Ali Rahman Badshah, Sayyid Ali Rahman Badshah came to be there is unknown. As popular beliefs have it, the saint Sayyid Ali Rahman Badshah was in the service of the Alwar state for giving advice on spiritual matters to King Mangal Singh. When the saint died, the king had him buried at his favorite spot that was facing Mecca. There is no historical evidence to entirely support this claim. Another popular opinion suggests that after the palace was dismantled and it was lying in ruins, it appealed to saints and yogis. Ali Rahman chose this secluded spot to pray to Allah. He had a small following, and after his death, the followers had him buried at the present spot. However, regardless of historical certainty about the origin of the grave, the transformation of the shrine from an obscure sacred space into a thriving religious shrine is something that can shed light on the complex nature of religious interaction, which according to me cannot be confined to a fixed understanding of religious categories. Namalnath, as I told you, Namalnath is an uninitiated member of the Nath Panth, which means his ears are not split. But he has a guru, one of the most important requirements of the order. When Namalnath came to the shrine, among his other jobs was to vivify the idol of Hanuman, because the idol of Hanuman was Khandit, was damaged. So, and as a result of that, the idol was actually still in an unawakened state, Achetan Avastha. I should show you the picture of this idol. So this idol, idol of the monkey god Hanuman, was in a Khandit state, in Achetan Avastha, unawakened state. And the idol vivification required Namalnath to stay there at least for 12 years in order to bring consciousness of power to the idol. And it was completely barren. Nobody was living there. It was very difficult to actually access the top of the Moti Dungri hill. So susceptible to many unseen and evil forces that permeated the surrounding, Namalnath would have been easily forced to leave during many terrifying nights, as he recalled to me, had he not been protected by Sayyid Baba, Ali Rahman, in the beginning. For instance, one day what happens, one day he was standing near the fort rampart and somebody pushed him from behind. No later than he was about to fall, a man attired in a white dress with white beard grabbed his hand and pushed him back and disappeared. The person was Sayyid Baba, and as many people narrated similar events in which they were helped by the saint, always attired in white. The protection of the Islamic saint was vital to Namalnath's pledge, and he was supported at every step. When I asked him this question, that why didn't Shiva get rid of ghosts and spirits, that they were there. So he answered, fighting ghosts and spirits is not an easy task because the two worship Shiva and derive power from his blessings. Thus, it becomes a matter of contestations among the two kind of followers of the god, namely the good ones and the bad ones. So in which the god Shiva cannot intervene. So, and that was the explanation of Navalnath. But here at this side, what is important, the Islamic saint protects the Hindu devotee who was on a mission to turn the place full of life, and including the idol of the monkey god by his tapas or yogic heat. Later on, what happened with time, more visitors actually started to arrive at the shrine, and the shrine was being transformed by their activities. People whose wishes got fulfilled, they started to donate materials at the shrine. Um, and this picture was actually taken by a devotee in 2013, and he shared this image with me. And you can observe the shrine is still comparatively small, and the courtyard is without a concrete flooring. And overall, I mean, I would say it was poverty stricken, or at least not so nice looking. A decade ago in 2003, the shrine was still, I mean, the condition was still worse in 2003. The shrine was still in open area under the sky, under the open sky. The corrugated iron roof that you see here wasn't installed, and there were no walls around the sacred objects located inside the shrine. A Hindu Baniya devotee from Alwar, who had a canteen in Kashmir, prayed to Ali Rahman Badshah one day that if during the Kargil war in 1999, those who do not know, which was fought between India and Pakistan, if his canteen remained safe, he would get a roof installed for the shrine. Luckily, nothing happened to his canteen, and he came back and donated 100,000 rupees, 1 lakh rupees, for some construction works. Similarly, many devotees also started donating materials and goods, and as a result of it, the shrine actually came to be in this form in 2013. And here actually the second part is over. I'm actually moving into the third part of the lecture, which is actually about the rise of disputes. So what happens after 2014, since Modi came to power and the BJP had established its governments at the center and in Rajasthan. And the shrine actually came under the attack of a recently formed right-wing Hindu organization called the Hindu Shakti Vahini. And it's not related to Adityanath's outfit called Hindu Yuva Vahini, but the names sound actually similar. The activists of this organization began to communalize the shrine. They intensified their activities in the following years. And for the first time in 2015, they organized a religious procession. You can see in the image on the top left image, in Hindi, it is written, Vishal Dhwaj Yatra par aapka hardik swagat karte hain, Hindu Shakti Vahini Alwar. So they actually organize a religious procession called Vishal Dhwaj Yatra, or the Great Flag Procession, every year. So now, since 2015, now every year the procession actually starts at 3 o'clock in the afternoon from the city center, and passing through all the main points of the city, finally reaches to the shrine around 7:30 p.m. in the evening. The top right image, in the top right image, you can see that about their programs that in 2000, it is a poster from 2017, and here you can see the procession actually, it mentions the timetable and also the places from Nai Sabji Mandi and other areas from which the procession will actually pass, and then finally in the evening at 7:30, it will reach to the top of the Moti Dongri hill at the Hanuman temple. The procession is actually usually joined by a large crowd, and you can see in the image in the bottom left image, a newspaper cutting of Alwar Patrika. it is amoral. I mean, last year, I think in 2019, it was joined by more than 10,000 people or so. So when they reach to the temple, they organize an annual bhandara or ritual feast, completely neglecting the graves of the two Islamic saints. Bottom right image, they are actually eating food, having a ritual feast, ritual offerings. Their religious activities focus only on worshipping Hindu figures, not Muslim figures. And in a very extreme act, in 2016 and 17, they insisted on actually erecting a wall in the shrine. They wanted to partition the two places, one half of the Islamic sense and the other half of Hindu figures. And in this process, one day, what they did in a very extreme act, they painted the entire shrine, including the two graves, in saffron color. And this act actually infuriated Naval Nath. He was actually manhandled, and also he was just one person there, so nobody actually listened to him. And the act actually infuriated Naval Nath, and as well as many Hindus and Muslim and Sikh devotees of the shrine. And in this image, you can see that the organization has hanged a billboard right here in front of the wall, as well as they have raised their flags in the shrine compound above the front wall. This was a highly disturbing act and also unacceptable act. So most Hindu and other devotees, in response to their act, came on one platform and decided to act unitedly against them and wanted to save the shrine. So apart from Muslims and Sikhs, Hindu devotees, who are mostly urban middle class Baniyas and Brahmins with wealth and power, they decided to fight back. And they quickly formed an organization by the name of Sayyid Baba Satsang Samiti. And here, actually, on the in this image, extreme left, you can see in the Hindi letters, Sayyid Baba Satsang Samiti is actually written. And they collected money, filed a police report, as well as put social pressure on the activists of HSV, Hindu Shakti Vahini. And as a result, the shrine actually soon came to its previous form. I mean, it took around 1 year or something, and it actually came to its previous form, and they again actually painted the shrine and remade it. So here we see, contrary to, I want to actually remind Haydn's thesis. Here we see members of one religious group can fight with other members of the same religious group to save the symbols of religious others, as well as to maintain a culture of coexistence. And not necessarily for, as Haydn would have it, manifesting dominance or controlling resources, but purely for the reasons of faith. And seeing this, I'm thinking from Haydn's perspective, what Haydn would have said about this is that processes, I quote here, processes of competition between groups that distinguish from each other may be manifested as syncretism, yet still result ultimately in the exclusion of the symbols of one group or another from a religious shrine. Unlike Haydn's claim, since the dispute, the organization SBSS, Sayyid Baba Satsang Samiti, dominated by Hindus, has started to follow what I call a process of cooperative segregation in order to save the culture of difference and the distinct identity of the two Islamic saints by making subtle statement through symbolic actions, and which we will actually talk about this symbolic actions in a while. Their intention is not to show any disrespect to Hindu religious symbols or to hurt religious feelings, but to protect a distinct religious culture. And in this process, first of all, for every Thursday prayers, they buy balloons in green and saffron colors and hang them in respective areas. And you can clearly see in this image, the balloons are actually in green and saffron colors. And even the poles
supporting the roof, and this is very funny, supporting the roof had been painted in uh, uh, respective religious colors after the incident, as well as these bulbs are also painted likewise in different colors. So here I want to say something about segregation. Um, and we all segregate. So we know segregation is an important element of identity making of an individual and collective beings. In the same sense, devotees of the shrine are trying to protect a distinct ontological being of the sense by introducing such new elements that I just show it to you. And along the line of segregation, I argue cooperation can also exist. And this is one of the major critiques of Haydn, and as well as of the Western scholarship on cosmopolitanism, who treat religious domains with a religious bias. That means, I mean, more often, the Western scholarship on cosmopolitanism treat religious. They don't even take religious domain into account, and if they do, then they take religious domains as monolithic cultural blocks, and often see it as the domain incapable and devoid of convivial engagement. And in in this image, you can see, in order to protect the sign, the Hindu devotees have installed a CCTV camera on the premises. I don't know whether it works or not, but at least it terrifies people for security purposes, so that the grapes are not targeted or attacked again. And the second poster on the right side is very interesting. And in this picture, which is about the annual URS celebration, death anniversary celebration of both the saints, and this annual URS started in 2004, and it was the 16th URS celebrated last year in 2019 when I was there, in honor of both the saints at the same time. To further undermine the claims of HSV, Hindu Shakti Vahini, the celebration of URS begins with recitation of the verses of the Hindu sacred epic Ramayana at the Hanuman temple. So in this image, you can see that there is, it says, Sri Sri 108 Sayyid Baba ka Bisal Bhandara, Sayyid Ali Rahman Badshah Pathan Jube Kha Baba ka Salana Sulwa Urs. That means 16th death annual celebration or death anniversary of Sayyid Ali Rahman Badshah and Pathan Jume Khan. The program says on 22nd October, the day was Tuesday, it mentions Ramayana part. And Ramayana, the recitation of Ramayana actually goes on for a couple of days, followed by Ramayana Samapan or Prasad Vitran. That means the end of the recitation ceremony, and also distribution of resources and distribution of offerings on 23rd of October on Wednesday. And after that, they start actually on Thursday the Bhandara or ritual feast of Sayyid Ali Rahman Badshah. And then in the evening, there is bhajan and Qawwali. So what happens by doing this? Both sort of celebrating Hindu cultural practices or recitation of Ramayana, as well as focusing on celebrating URS, they make a statement about the unity of the integrated shrine and also of the saints and gods, while maintaining and respecting difference. And as I already actually told you, this the religious recitation of Ramayana takes place, I mean, at least for the last 2 years, on Tuesdays, the day of Hanuman, and goes on till Wednesday, followed by the performance of Qawwali and URS celebration on Thursdays in every last week of October for the last 2 years. And this is how the shrine has actually been saved, and it is thriving. And I end my third part here. I'm moving to the fourth and final part. It wouldn't take more than, what's the time now? Another 5 or 10 minutes. So after the dispute, as I said, the shrine has thrived than ever before. You can see the difference in this photo. The courtyard in front of the shrine now has a concrete flooring on the right side with comparatively better and beautiful gates and walls. There are also several benches like this one, donated by devotees, and also uh, there, they also donate, I mean, all sorts of things. But this bench is very interesting because, I mean, it's not only a donation, but also it is a marketing strategy. That's how I see it. Here it is written that the donor is in the business of selling chairs and tables, and he has left his phone number for interested customers. The flow of money and material resources in the last 2 years, as well as wealth and power of devotees, have completely transformed this religious space within a short period of time. So the following images of the annual Urs celebration will give you an idea of which happened last year. Will tell you about the flourishing story of the shrine. The courtyard and gates on that day are well decorated, and you can clearly see it. Both the gates are decorated, and in the courtyard there are sort of mats and various pandals, canopies. And inside the shrine, there are garlands of flowers hanging everywhere, and also around the graves of the saints and the Hanuman temple. Now I'm going to show you another video which will further testify the fact that for the last 2 years, huge amount of money and resources are being spent during the annual Urs celebration that takes place on a large scale. And I argue all of it is only possible because the power of devotees. Here is it.
Mukesh, if you could wrap up now, then we also have some time for discussion. Mukesh, could you wrap up now so we have some time for discussion? Mukesh? No.
Okay, so as you have seen here, the power of urban devotees has not only protected the shrine, but also from losing its unique characteristics, but also has played an important role in revitalizing this entire urban zone, which is a byproduct of their intense religious activities. As a result of it, the entire area has actually transformed completely. So, seen in excess use of the place, the municipality has also developed 2 parks in the vicinity. In the left image, there's a park for children's use located at the bottom of the hill, and in the second image, this park is actually located right below the shrine on second level of the hill of the fort. And then now municipality is also coming up with more urban plans for the renewal of this former palace space, which would have been lost to history if the shrine was not founded there. Obviously, religious festivals and ritual celebrations require an easy accessibility of goods and products for the purpose of celebrations. Therefore, a small market is also developing at the bottom of the hill along either sides of the road that was constructed some years ago. And the road, as I told you before, leads to the top of the hill. And here actually I end my presentation, but there is conclusion left. Borrowing from works of Glenn Bauman, a scholar who has actually extensively written on sacred science, I conclude, although it is less easy to conceptualize and far richer to think with, meeting zones of shared shrines with their convoluted nature of religious interactions and self-conceptualizations should be seen as spheres where religious cultures and identities are local products rather than extensions of the hegemonic orthodox and fundamentalist discourses of institutional religions and the state. Thank you so much.